I never believed in Bigfoot, at least not until I saw it with my own eyes. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, and even now I still break into a cold sweat whenever I think about it. My name isn't important, but what you should know is that I'm a park ranger with 15 years of experience handling wildlife. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, wolves, just about every dangerous animal you can imagine. Nothing, though, could have prepared me for what I encountered in those woods. It all started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late September. The leaves were just starting to turn, and I was looking forward to a quiet fall before winter set in. My supervisor called me around 7 a.m., which was odd, since he never came into the office before 9. His voice sounded different, tense in a way I'd never heard before. He told me they needed me for a special assignment, top secret, with triple the normal pay. Triple, that should have been my first red flag, but money was tight. My truck had broken down the week before, and the repair bill had drained most of my savings. On top of that, my daughter was starting college the following year, so every extra dollar counted. My supervisor wouldn't give me any details over the phone. He just told me to meet him at the ranger station at 6 the next morning. When I pressed for more information, he paused, then said it involved a dangerous animal situation and they needed someone with experience. He stressed that absolute discretion was critical. I wasn't allowed to discuss the mission with anyone, not even my wife. That night, I barely slept. Something about the conversation didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept telling myself it was probably just a bear or a mountain lion that had been causing trouble, maybe attacking livestock, maybe threatening hikers. Maybe the landowner was someone important who wanted it handled quietly. I pulled into the ranger station just before 6 and noticed a black pickup waiting in the lot. 3 men were already in the back. Their breath hung in the cold morning air. I recognized 2 of them rangers from neighboring counties, both tough, seasoned guys I'd worked with before. The third man I didn't know, but he had the rugged, weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. None of us said much as we climbed in. Everyone looked tense, which only confirmed my suspicion that we were dealing with a serious wildlife issue. The 2 rangers I knew gave me a quick nod, but nobody felt like talking. We checked our gear, braced ourselves for a long ride, and the truck pulled out, heading toward the mountains on roads I'd driven 100 times before. But after about 20 minutes, we turned onto a logging road I'd never seen. The track was rough, just 2 deep ruts cutting through the forest, and the truck jolted and bounced as the driver maneuvered around rocks and fallen branches. After about 40 minutes, the guy in the passenger seat finally turned around to face us. That was when things really got strange. He was wearing a business suit, crisp tie, polished shoes, perfectly combed hair. He looked more like he was headed to a board meeting than into the backcountry to deal with a dangerous predator. But what struck me most wasn't his clothes, it was his face. He looked terrified. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of his seat. His eyes were wide and hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. He studied each of us in silence for a long moment before clearing his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice shook completely at odds with the confidence you'd expect from a man in an expensive suit. He told us flat out, we were being paid more than we'd ever been paid for any job, and in return, we had to keep our mouths shut. About everything. Total secrecy. If word got out about what we were about to see, there would be serious consequences. He didn't say what those consequences were, but the fear in his voice made it clear he wasn't just bluffing. The way he delivered the warning wasn't exactly threatening. It was something else, like raw, desperate fear. Fear that whatever we were about to face was just as bad as he believed it to be. The 4 of us exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The silence in the back of that truck felt heavy, suffocating. I found myself staring at the man in the suit as the truck carried us deeper into the unknown. He kept checking his watch and glancing back at the forest behind us, like he was expecting something to come chasing the truck. His hands trembled nonstop, and he kept wiping sweat from his forehead, even though the morning air was cold enough that the rest of us were wearing jackets. After an hour of bouncing along rougher and rougher roads, we finally stopped at what could barely be called a clearing. It looked more like someone had chopped down just enough trees to fit a truck. The forest pressed in on all sides, thick, dark, suffocating, even under the pale morning sun. The man in the suit stepped out of the truck and walked around to the back, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that looked expensive and completely out of place out here. He set it on the tailgate and pulled out a detailed topographic map, the kind the military uses. The map showed terrain features I didn't recognize, even though I thought I knew these woods better than anyone. He pointed to a spot deep in the backcountry, our designated camp roughly 8 to 10 miles from where we stood. Then he traced to another area about 2 miles from camp where he said we needed to set traps. His fingers shook as he outlined the route. The creature we were after, he explained, was massive and violent. It had attacked several hikers over the past month, though he avoided giving us specifics. Our job was to contain it, preferably capture it alive, but lethal force was authorized if necessary. He warned us, in no uncertain terms, that this thing was extremely dangerous and not to underestimate it, no matter how much experience we had with predators. As we began unloading equipment from the truck, my stomach turned cold. These weren't ordinary traps. They were bear traps, but not like any I'd ever seen in my 15 years of wildlife management. Each one was nearly 3 feet across, with steel jaws that looked like they could snap a telephone pole in half. The teeth were razor sharp, almost 6 inches long. One of the other rangers let out a low whistle as he hefted a trap. It had to weigh 100 pounds, maybe more. The chains attached to each trap were just as intimidating, thick steel links that looked more suited for anchoring ships than catching animals. "What exactly are we hunting?" one of the rangers finally asked. He eyed the massive traps with the same uneasy feeling churning in my gut. These weren't meant for any ordinary bear. The man in the suit hesitated a long moment, carefully choosing his words. "The animal hasn't been identified," he said at last. "It's extremely large, without question dangerous, and it's been terrorizing hikers for weeks. That's all you need to know." He wouldn't meet our eyes as he said it, instead staring down at the map. He never called it a bear, but all of us thought the same thing anyway. Maybe some kind of mutated grizzly. Maybe an unusually large predator. But those traps, they suggested something bigger than the biggest bear ever recorded. The longer I looked at them, the more unease crept into my chest. We slung heavy packs onto our shoulders, each weighing close to 60 pounds, plus one of those monstrous traps apiece. Then, without another word, we started the long hike toward the designated campsite. The trek would have been brutal under normal circumstances, but there was something about this forest that made it 10 times worse. From the moment we left the rough road and stepped beneath the trees, it just felt wrong. Too quiet. In 15 years working the wild, I'd never experienced silence like this. No birdsong, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush, no insects buzzing in our ears. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, like the forest itself was swallowing the sound. The trees grew closer here than anywhere I'd worked before, their branches weaving together into a canopy so thick that almost no sunlight reached the forest floor. Everything was cast in a kind of perpetual twilight, making it hard to judge distance. The air was heavy, suffocating, like breathing soup. Half a mile in, we found the first signs that something was very wrong. Scattered camping gear, a shredded backpack dangling from a branch nearly 8 feet off the ground, pieces of a torn sleeping bag strewn across the dirt. The damage didn't look random, not like a bear tearing through someone's campsite. Then came the blood-dark, dried patches smeared on tree trunks, some of them more than 8 feet high. It looked old, seeped deep into the bark, as if it had been there for weeks. Whatever left those stains was either incredibly tall, or it had thrown something bloody with terrifying force. One of the rangers crouched down to study a torn scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. The cloth was thick, looked like it had come from a heavy jacket or camping gear, but the way it was ripped told us everything. This wasn't done by claws. The tear was clean, straight, as if something had ripped it apart with raw strength bare hands. We pressed on, but the mood had shifted completely. The easy chatter from earlier was gone. Everyone's eyes were locked on the tree line, rifles gripped tighter than they needed to be. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch that cracked in the distance sounded like approaching footsteps. The deeper we went, the more carnage we uncovered. Torn clothing, more blood, camping equipment scattered like confetti. At one point, we came across the remains of an entire tent, shredded to ribbons. The nylon was ripped, the aluminum poles bent and twisted into unnatural shapes, the stakes ripped from the ground with such force they still clung to chunks of dirt. But the worst part was the smell. The farther we went, the stronger it became, a pungent, musky odor, animal-like, but mixed with something else. Something we couldn't place. Something that didn't belong. The smell only got worse the farther we hiked. It reminded me of wet fur mixed with rotting meat. After a while, it became so overpowering that we were forced to breathe through our mouths. 2 hours of trudging through that nightmare landscape brought us to something that stopped every one of us cold. In a small clearing where the canopy opened just enough for sunlight to break through, we found footprints pressed deep into the soft ground. At first, we all rushed over, finally thinking we might have a clue about what we were dealing with. Maybe we could identify the species and prepare properly. The tracks were preserved perfectly in the mud near a narrow stream. But once we saw them clearly, our faces went pale. They were enormous. Each one nearly 18 inches long, about 8 inches across at the widest point. But they weren't bare prints, they weren't claw marks. They looked human footprints, blown up to a monstrous size. Every toe was clearly defined. The arch was visible, even the heel pressed deep into the mud. But no human had feet that size, and no human weighed enough to sink that deep into the earth. We found dozens of prints leading off in different directions, some partially covered by leaves and debris, evidence they'd been made at different times over days, maybe weeks. The stride was massive, at least 4 feet between steps. That meant whatever made them was either impossibly tall or moved with inhumanly long strides. One ranger crouched down, setting his size 11 hiking boot inside a print for scale. His boot looked like a child's shoe in comparison, and the depth of the track suggested something unimaginably heavy, far heavier than any bear I'd ever tracked. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "No bear leaves prints like this. No animal I've ever seen does. These look almost human. But no person could be this big, this heavy." We spent nearly half an hour circling the clearing, studying the prints, searching for any reasonable explanation. There was none. These weren't tracks that belonged in the natural order of things. They belonged to something that shouldn't exist. That was when 2 of our group finally made up their minds. They dropped their packs right there in the clearing and started pulling out their personal belongings. "I'm done," one of them said flatly. "Whatever this is, I didn't sign up for it. My wife's pregnant with our first kid, and I'm not dying out here for any paycheck." The other nodded, slinging a lighter pack over his shoulder and abandoning the government-issued gear. "You guys should turn back with us," he warned, his eyes scanning the trees. "This feels wrong. Everything about this feels wrong. Those aren't animal tracks, and whatever made them, it's not going to be stopped by the crap they gave us." They started heading back down the trail, and I'll admit part of me wanted to follow. My gut screamed the same thing, that we were walking into something unmanageable, something beyond comprehension. But the money, it was too much to walk away from. I told myself I'd been through danger before. I'd survived predators before. I could survive this. We watched the 2 rangers disappear into the tree line, the forest somehow even quieter after they were gone. The 13 of us left behind stood in uneasy silence around the impossible tracks. No one wanted to be the first to suggest we keep going. No one wanted to be the one to lead us deeper into whatever territory we had just stepped into. In the end, the oldest and most experienced ranger in our group shouldered his pack and tightened the straps. "We've come this far," he said quietly. "At the very least, we set camp and figure out what we're really dealing with. But the moment things look like they're beyond our control, we walk." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, then fell in line. The final stretch to the designated campsite took another 2 hours, and it felt like marching through a graveyard. The oppressive silence pressed down on us, broken only by our own footsteps and the occasional distant crack echoing from deep within the trees, too sharp, too heavy to be the natural fall of deadwood. Along the way, we found more signs. Branches snapped high above our heads, at heights that would take enormous force to reach. Strange gouges carved deep into bark, too deliberate, too high to be from any normal animal. Once, we came across a boulder the size of a refrigerator, rolled several feet from where it had once rested. The ground beneath it was torn up, showing where something had dragged or shoved it aside like it weighed nothing. The campsite lay in a circular clearing, about 150 feet across, surrounded on all sides by dense timber. A narrow stream cut along one edge. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the perfect place to set up camp. But knowing what might be lurking out there turned it into a trap. The trees formed a wall around us. If something massive came charging from the shadows, we'd have nowhere to run. We pitched our tents in a tight circle at the center of the clearing and ringed a fire pit with stones from the stream. The sun was sinking fast, and the temperature dropped with it. None of us wanted to be fumbling in the dark to set camp not here. As I worked, I kept catching flickers of movement at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned, nothing was there, just black trees and deepening shadows. but the sensation of being watched crawled over my skin, raising goosebumps I couldn't shake. Judging by the way the others kept glancing at the tree line, hands never straying far from their rifles, I wasn't the only one feeling it. One of the rangers suggested setting up a perimeter alarm using empty cans filled with rocks, strung on fishing line around the camp. It sounded like a good idea, so we spent the last fading hour of daylight weaving nearly 300 feet of nearly invisible line into a rough tripwire network, the cans hanging like crude bells. If anything tried to push into the clearing, we'd hear it first. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We left the giant traps untouched for now, saving them for the morning when we could place them at the mapped-out locations. Still, just looking at those steel jaws made my stomach churn. They were monstrous, spring-loaded iron teeth sharp enough to cut through bone, powerful enough to snap an elephant's leg in two. Each chain was anchored to steel stakes. We had to hammer deep into the soil with sledgehammers. Everything about those traps screamed that we were up against something huge, something terrifyingly strong. That night, we sat around the fire, trying to keep the conversation light, forcing laughter that never quite reached our eyes. But no one could shake the tension. Every crack of the firewood made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift. And all of us knew we were waiting for something. We took turns telling stories about dangerous animal encounters we'd had on the job, trying to convince ourselves this was just another routine assignment. Black bears raiding campgrounds, mountain lions shadowing hikers, bull moose charging during rut season. But even the worst of those stories felt hollow compared to what we'd already seen here. None of us had ever faced a creature that left 18-inch human-like footprints, or ripped through camping gear like tissue paper. Night fell, and the forest around us stayed disturbingly silent. No owls, no rustle of nocturnal animals, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if every living thing had fled, leaving us alone with whatever had caused all that destruction. I was assigned second watch, which meant I had a couple hours to try and sleep before my turn. But sleep didn't come. Every little noise had me gripping my rifle. The fire cast shifting shadows that looked like shapes moving through the trees. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps creeping closer. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and just lay in my tent, listening. That's when I heard it for the first time. A deep, resonant roar, low, guttural rolling out of the forest. It wasn't exactly a growl, and it wasn't a call either, but it was alive, and it was huge. The sound carried for 10 long seconds before fading, and every hair on my body stood on end. Whatever made that noise was massive enough for its voice to echo for miles through the woods. I prayed I'd imagined it, but 20 minutes later, it came again from another direction this time. I finally drifted into uneasy sleep around 3 a.m., only to be plagued by nightmares, towering shapes moving through the treetops, glowing eyes watching us from beyond the firelight. At 4:30 a.m., the camp exploded with sound. Not one or two cans, but dozens, all going off at once. The perimeter alarms we'd set clattered and banged like 100 iron bells ringing in the night. It was deafening, chaos cutting through the forest's silence. We scrambled out of our tents, rifles in hand, some of us half-dressed. The noise came from every direction at once, as though something or several somethings were circling us. For nearly a full minute, the racket continued, cans clattering, lines snapping, before it abruptly stopped. We rushed to the edge of camp, flashlights slicing through the dark, rifles raised. The lines were torn in dozens of places, not frayed, ripped, shredded. Some cans were thrown with such force they'd embedded themselves in tree trunks 20 feet away from where they'd hung. One ranger swore he'd heard footsteps in the chaos. Heavy ones, he said. Deliberate. Sounded human, but heavier. A hell of a lot heavier. It was walking circles around our camp, always just out of range of the flashlights. The forest went still again, but none of us lowered our weapons. We stood in a defensive circle around the fire the rest of the night, backs to the flames, eyes straining into the darkness beyond. Nobody even suggested trying to sleep. Whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. It had gotten close enough to trip the alarms without ever being seen. The waiting was the worst part. We knew something was watching us, hunting us from the tree line, but we couldn't see it, couldn't hear it. It was like being stalked by an invisible predator, something that could strike at any moment. When dawn finally broke, we split into pairs and prepared to set the traps marked on the map. No one wanted to leave the relative safety of camp, but we had a job to do. We packed our frames with the massive steel traps, spare ammunition, and emergency flares. The first site was only a mile or so from camp, but the trail we followed wasn't like any game trail I'd ever seen. It had been worn into the forest through years of use, but it was far too wide for deer or moose. Trees on either side had been shoved aside or snapped down, leaving a corridor almost 8 feet across. The soil was packed hard from countless heavy steps, and everywhere we looked were those same massive footprints, sunk deep into the earth. It took nearly an hour to set the first trap. We dug a shallow pit, half-buried the steel jaws, then covered them with branches and leaves. The trap was so heavy it took 3 of us working together to move it, and anchoring the stakes required swinging a 10-pound sledge. The whole time, I felt eyes on me. Every few minutes, I stopped, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But the others admitted they felt it too, jerking their heads toward the brush at the slightest sound. The second location was worse. The trail narrowed between 2 massive boulders, forming a natural choke point where anything passing through would have to funnel close. But the place had been altered. Branches had been deliberately woven between the rocks, forming a crude barrier, and carved into the stone itself were markings. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate symbols. Some were simple, circles, triangles, parallel lines. Others were more complex, resembling crude hieroglyphs or ancient cave paintings. They'd been cut deep into solid rock by something sharp and incredibly strong, gouges so deep they could only have been made with unnatural force. Fresh footprints littered the ground. Some were so new they could have been made during the night while we slept. Tracks led directly up to the boulders where we stood, then disappeared on the far side. Whatever made them had passed through here recently, maybe even watched us while we worked. The thought made my blood run cold. This thing wasn't just strong, it was intelligent, smart enough to stalk us, smart enough to avoid being seen, and maybe smart enough to know exactly what we were trying to do. By early afternoon, we'd finished setting all 6 traps and trudged back to camp, hungry and exhausted. For the first time since entering the forest, things almost felt normal. We heated canned food over the fire, swapped stories about our families back home. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, birds began to sing again. The crushing tension of the previous night seemed to lift. For 3 fleeting hours, we let ourselves believe maybe whatever was out there had moved on. Then the scream shattered everything. It tore through the forest from the direction of the largest trap, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard in 15 years of wildlife management. Part animal roar, part human scream filled with fury and agony. It rose and fell like a siren, echoing endlessly through the trees. We grabbed rifles and med kits and sprinted toward the sound, crashing through brush and leaping over fallen logs. The scream grew louder as we closed in, more frantic, more desperate, and beneath it came other sounds, the clatter of chains, the sharp crack of branches snapping, and the metallic shriek of steel being bent to the breaking point. What we found at the trap still haunts me in nightmares. The trap had worked. Something enormous was caught between those steel jaws, and it was thrashing with terrifying fury. At first glance, through the trees and brush, it looked like a giant covered head to toe in dark brown hair. But as we drew closer, the details sharpened, and I realized we weren't looking at any animal I'd ever seen. The thing stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Its shoulders spanned nearly 4 feet across, broader than any man could ever be, and its arms hung down too long, thick and corded with muscle. Its massive hands ended in black, blunt claws that looked strong enough to rip bark from a tree. But it was the face that froze me. Not human, but not ape either. Heavy brow ridges, a jaw far too big, too powerful, eyes set wide apart. Yet behind those features burned something else: intelligence, awareness, a knowing that no wild animal should ever have. When it saw us approach, it let out a scream so piercing it rattled my chest. The steel trap had clamped around its left leg, just above the ankle, and it was trying to wrench the jaws apart with its bare hands. The chain stretched taut, groaning under the strain, metal shrieking as if it might snap. For several seconds, we just stood there, stunned. This thing wasn't supposed to exist. It looked like something torn from the fossil record, a missing link that should have been extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it knew. It saw our hesitation, saw our fear. The creature stopped, struggling, and turned its attention on us, studying each face one by one. Its gaze was full of hatred, yes, but there was also something else: recognition, as if it understood exactly who we were and what we had done to it. Finally, one of the rangers raised his trembling hands, leveling a tranquilizer rifle loaded with enough sedative to drop a full-grown grizzly. He took aim at its shoulder and fired. The dart struck with a dull thunk, embedding in its thick hide. We stepped back, waiting, but nothing happened. The creature glanced down, plucked the dart from its flesh with 2 fingers, and flung it back at us. If anything, it only grew more enraged, thrashing with renewed violence. The ranger fired again, this time at its chest, where the drug should have been absorbed quickly. Again, nothing. The dose meant for a 900-pound bear barely slowed it down. A third dart. A fourth. Finally, after what felt like forever, the beast began to weaken. Its movements grew sluggish, its body swaying. But it never lost consciousness. Even as its knees buckled, even as its weight dragged it down against the steel jaws, its eyes stayed locked on us, burning with a terrible, intelligent rage. It took all 13 of us working together to drag the half-conscious creature onto the reinforced cart we'd brought for transport. The thing fought us even as its limbs trembled with exhaustion, forcing every muscle in our bodies to strain just to restrain it. And even then, it never looked away. Those eyes followed us with a clarity that made my skin crawl. Even sedated, it had to weigh 600 pounds, maybe more. We bound its arms and legs with heavy chains, the kind built for this exact purpose. The locks and fittings weren't improvised, they'd been designed for this, which meant someone knew, long before we did, exactly what we'd be facing. As we secured the creature for transport, I got my closest look yet. Its leg, clamped in the steel jaws, wasn't broken. That alone was impossible. The trap's bite should have snapped bone like dry wood. The only explanation was that its bones were unimaginably dense, strong enough to withstand crushing force without shattering. Its coat was thick and coarse, more like the bristles of a wild boar than the softer fur of a primate. Beneath that, its muscles looked carved from stone. This thing wasn't just strong, it was built by evolution to endure, to survive conditions that would kill a man in hours. But what chilled me most were its hands and feet. Too big, too strong, but undeniably human in design. The same joints, thumbs set opposite the fingers, feet with arches, toes, spaced just like ours, the same structure we'd seen stamped into the mud. Back at camp, we assembled a cage from steel panels packed in our supply crates. The pieces bolted together seamlessly, every bracket and hinge fitting perfectly, like it had been custom built with precise measurements. The cage stood tall enough to hold a 9-foot giant, its bars thick enough to withstand inconceivable force. We shoved the half-conscious creature inside and slammed the reinforced locks. Even unconscious, it radiated menace. In the confined space of the cage, its size and power seemed even greater than they had in the forest. Under daylight, I could finally study it. The archaic shape of the skull, the massive bone structure, the way its hair grew in thick, patterned layers. Everything about it spoke of something that had evolved apart from modern humans for hundreds of thousands of years. We had to dose it every few hours with fresh sedatives just to keep it manageable. And every time it stirred half awake, its eyes fluttering open, it fixed us with a look that froze the blood in our veins. Those weren't the eyes of a dumb beast. There was thought behind them. Hatred, calculation. It studied us, not wildly, not aimlessly, deliberately, focusing on one man at a time, memorizing his face, then moving on to the next, like it was making a list of enemies it would never forget. That night, we drew straws for guard duty. 2 men at a time would watch the cage while the others tried to sleep. I volunteered for the first shift alongside the oldest ranger in our group. We sat barely 10 feet away, rifles resting across our knees, close enough to watch its every breath, far enough that it couldn't reach us through the bars. For hours, nothing happened. The thing lay still, breathing slow and heavy. We whispered occasionally, keeping our voices low, careful not to stir it. Then, around 2 a.m., the perimeter alarms began to rattle. This time, we saw what triggered them. Shadows moved between the trees, shapes massive, hulking, slipping in and out of sight. At least 3, maybe 4, maybe more. They stayed just beyond the firelight, circling, watching. Every so often, one would shift wrong and I'd catch a glimpse. Huge silhouettes, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace. And that was when we realized the one in the cage wasn't alone. There are more of them, my partner whispered, his voice barely audible. A whole family out there. The shapes in the forest seemed to murmur to each other in low, rumbling tones we felt more than heard. They were communicating, coordinating, taking positions around the camp like they were preparing for a tactical assault. We woke the rest of the group as quietly as we could. Everyone grabbed their weapons, but none of us dared step beyond the fire's glow. Out there, they had every advantage: numbers, darkness, and a perfect knowledge of the terrain. That was when the rocks started flying. The first one screamed out of the darkness and landed square in the fire pit, scattering burning logs and spraying sparks into the air. Then came a barrage, some the size of baseballs, others as large as bowling balls, hurled with frightening force and uncanny precision. We scattered, diving behind trees and gear for cover, but the bombardment didn't let up. For nearly an hour, stones pounded our camp. The creatures in the woods stayed hidden, using the darkness to their advantage, always circling, never showing themselves. The worst part wasn't the rocks, it was the coordination. While some hurled missiles, others crashed branches and stomped from different angles, tricking us into thinking we were surrounded by dozens. Every time we tried to regroup or mount some kind of counterattack, another volley would slam in from the blackness, forcing us back into defense. They pinned us down for hours without ever stepping into the light, proving beyond doubt they weren't just strong, but smart, organized, strategic. The psychological toll was brutal. The noise, the feeling of being surrounded, the certainty that hostile, intelligent predators were watching our every move. It chipped away at our nerves, at our ability to think clearly. And then, just before dawn, it stopped. The forest fell silent again. But the silence wasn't relief, it was worse. Because we knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. We huddled by the dying fire, taking turns on watch, flinching at every rustle of leaves. By morning, we were drained physically, mentally, spiritually. The oldest, most experienced ranger, the one who had led us from the start, called us together. He looked years older than when we'd arrived, like the fear had aged him overnight. His face was grim as he studied us, saw the exhaustion and terror in our eyes. "This was a mistake," he said quietly. "We don't belong here. Whatever these things are, they won't stop until they get their own back. And there are more of them than us." He paused, his voice steady but resolute. "They're smarter than we thought, better organized, and this is their ground, not ours." He let his gaze move over each of us before he spoke again. "I'm calling this off. Pack it up, we're leaving." No one argued. We'd all come to the same conclusion during that endless night. This was beyond training, beyond equipment, beyond our ability to handle. We weren't just outmatched. We were trespassers in a territory we had no right to enter, and if we stayed, we'd die. As we tore down camp and loaded our packs, I couldn't help but glance at the cage. The creature inside was waking, the sedatives wearing thin. It watched us in silence as we worked, those calculating eyes following every move. There was no panic in its expression, no desperation. If anything, it looked satisfied, like it knew, like it understood its family was close, and that we'd finally gotten smart enough to get out of their way. We began our retreat in a tight formation, eyes sweeping the tree line for any sign of movement. The sounds of the others, the ones still out there, followed us for the first mile, branches snapping in the distance, low, rumbling calls like signals coordinating their movement, and always that unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pacing us through the forest, just out of sight. But they never showed themselves. Maybe they just wanted to make sure we were really leaving their territory, or maybe they were too focused on freeing the one we had captured. Either way, the message was clear: keep moving, don't come back. Every step away from camp felt like a small victory, but none of us dared relax. The forest around us was deathly silent, broken only by the sound of something massive shadowing us through the trees. We marched as quickly as we could without breaking formation. No one wanted to be the one who fell behind. Halfway back, the sounds began behind us. The screech of metal under strain, something heavy crashing and tossing through the camp. And then the same unearthly screams we'd heard when the trap first closed. It was obvious. They were tearing our camp apart, smashing the cage, freeing their kin. The noise carried through the trees for nearly an hour as we pushed farther and farther away. Not one of us suggested turning back. Not one of us wanted to try to recapture what we had taken. We learned our lesson about underestimating what we were facing. When we finally reached the rough road where the truck had dropped us off, I thought for the first time in days that I could breathe. But the truck wasn't there. We'd been told someone would be waiting when we were ready to pull out. The road was empty. We waited 3 long hours before another black SUV finally appeared. The man in the business suit was in the passenger seat again. Only now, he looked worse, like the life had been drained out of him. His face was ghostly pale, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the radio he clutched, barking panicked updates to someone on the other end. The ride back to civilization was silent. None of us spoke. The man in the suit barely looked at us, too busy with urgent conversations about failure of containment, asset recovery, and secondary protocols. Back at the ranger station where this nightmare had begun, we were separated immediately, taken to different locations for debriefing. I sat in a windowless room for 6 hours, questioned by 2 men in identical gray suits. The same questions over and over. Every detail, every feature of the creatures, their numbers, their abilities. They were most interested in the intelligence, the coordination, the tools, the communication, the fact that they hadn't just acted like animals, they'd acted like a unit, like people. At the end, they slid papers across the table. Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, statements admitting everything I had seen was classified at the highest government level. They didn't mince words. If I ever spoke about this, there would be consequences, legal consequences, criminal charges, but they didn't need to threaten us. None of us wanted to talk about it. Who would believe us anyway? And maybe more importantly, who would even want to know that creatures like this existed in the forests of our national parks? I was given 2 weeks of paid leave and reassigned to a different district. My official records show nothing unusual, just another standard wildlife control assignment. On paper, nothing happened at all, but I know better. From the way the other rangers looked at me afterward, I knew the truth was already spreading through unofficial channels. Quietly, carefully, but spreading all the same. Rumors of similar encounters in other parts of the country, stories about government task forces specializing in these kinds of containment operations, whispers of research facilities where captured specimens were taken. Within a month, I learned that the entire forest where we'd been deployed had been quietly shut down to the public. The official reason was unstable ground conditions that made hiking unsafe. Anyone who knew that land understood how absurd that was. Barriers went up. No trespassing signs posted on every access point. The entire area declared off-limits. But I heard through the grapevine that experts had been brought in, anthropologists, military personnel, and teams carrying equipment I couldn't even identify. Whatever those creatures were, the government wasn't just interested in containing them. They wanted to study them, and they wanted to keep their existence buried. I never found out what happened to the one we caught. A small part of me hoped they released it back to its family once they had what they wanted. But the way the scientists looked at it, their sharp, hungry interest, I doubt it was that simple. 6 months later, I put in for a transfer. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons. He didn't press. I think he understood. Some of us who had been on that mission needed to get as far away from those woods as possible. Even now, 3 years later, I still wake some nights convinced I can hear that low, resonant call drifting through the dark. Sometimes I catch myself staring too long into a tree line, expecting to see towering shapes moving where no living thing should be. I've since heard other rangers whisper about encounters like ours, scattered across the country, sightings buried, evidence lost, witnesses reassigned or suddenly choosing early retirement. There's an unofficial network now, people like me who've seen too much. Sometimes we share scraps of information with one another. Officially, of course, these creatures don't exist. Every sighting gets chalked up to a misidentified bear, a hoax, or the stress of isolation in the wilderness. But those of us who've seen them know better. What unsettles me most is realizing this isn't new. These beings aren't a recent phenomenon. They've been here hiding in our forests for God knows how long, avoiding us, watching us, coexisting in the shadows. And now, as we expand deeper into the wild and our surveillance technology sharpens, the encounters are becoming harder to hide. The government's response proves this has been managed for years, maybe decades. The specialized equipment, the protocols, the network of people who know exactly what to do when it happens. None of that gets built overnight. This is a long-term operation, one that most people, even most government employees, will never know exists. But then I think about the intelligence of those creatures, about how easily they can hide when they want to. Maybe this arrangement is for the best. They stay in the deep wilderness, far from where most people will ever tread. We stay in the cities and developed areas, and in that separation, maybe everyone stays safer. I've thought about quitting the ranger service entirely, moving to a city, taking a job as far away from the wild as possible, but this is the only life I've ever known. And someone has to be out there who understands what's really happening. Someone has to watch for signs that these creatures are expanding their range or becoming more aggressive toward humans. Because that's what worries me most about everything we saw. They weren't just defending their territory. They were studying us, testing our strengths, our weaknesses, our tactics. The coordinated assault on our camp proved it. These things think tactically. They can plan. And if they ever decide that coexistence isn't working anymore, if human expansion pushes too far into their world, conflict will be inevitable. And make no mistake, they are strong enough to tear steel traps apart with their bare hands, smart enough to outmaneuver trained teams, numerous enough to move in family groups across different forests. The government clearly has contingency plans, but I can't help but wonder, are those plans enough? Enough to counter a species that's avoided discovery for centuries, maybe millennia? We only managed to capture one through blind luck and overwhelming firepower, and within hours, its kind had freed it and driven us out of their land completely. The official reports from our mission were heavily redacted and sealed under the highest classifications, but I know they're being used to design new protocols for future encounters. Somewhere, in some facility, people are studying every detail of what we saw, building strategies, refining weapons, but I hope they're also considering the alternative, leaving them alone. Because if our brief encounter proved anything, it's that these creatures are more than capable of defending themselves, of protecting their territory. The wisest thing we could do may be to set boundaries and respect them. The forest where we had our encounter remains closed. I know for a fact there are monitoring stations scattered throughout the region, motion sensors, cameras, listening devices, turning the whole wilderness into one giant research zone. I often wonder what those systems have picked up since. Are they still there? Or have they moved deeper into the wilderness to avoid our eyes? Do they understand they're being watched? And if so, how have they adapted? These are questions I'll never have the answers to. And so here we are trapped in a strange reality, where only a handful of officials and researchers know about the existence of an undiscovered branch of humanity, while the rest of the world sleeps in ignorance. The weight of that secret grows heavier every year, especially when I see families heading into the woods to camp, laughing, unaware of what might be watching from the tree line. If you don't believe this story, that's fine. I honestly hope you never have to find out for yourself whether I'm telling the truth. But if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness, and you feel like you're being watched, trust that feeling. If you ever hear sounds that don't belong to any animal you know, if you come across footprints far too large, far too human, if the forest around you falls into complete silence, leave. Don't investigate. Don't try to take photos or gather proof. Leave as quickly and quietly as you can. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because once they know you've seen them, they won't forget, and they don't forgive. All I know for certain is this. These creatures are real, they are intelligent, and they're still out there. Anyone who dares to step into their territory deserves to know the truth of what may happen. For now, they seem content to remain in the deep wilderness, far from people. But with climate change, deforestation, and the relentless spread of human development into the remotest corners of the land, these encounters will only become more frequent. And when they do, we're going to need people who understand what we're really dealing with, people who won't dismiss the signs, people who will be ready, because they're watching. And they remember,